So, as you heard me saying, I gave the history of how capitalism was created by primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation in Africa became colonialism that took away land from the people. And when people do not have land, you are reliant on those that have land to provide food for the people.
Absolutely.
And so Zimbabwe was never going to develop as long as the land was in the hands of the same colonizer and the same settler that was occupying their land and colonizing them and wanting to create dependency in them. Zimbabwe was never going to prosper that way. So Zimbabwe had to deconstruct what the Israelites have done in the Bible, which is to take back your land so that you can be dependent on yourself. And you need to take 40 years within the desert to learn how it is to be self-sufficient people and people who believe in yourselves. And that's exactly what has been happening in Zimbabwe. And now we're starting to see Zimbabwe is wheat self-sufficient this year. And it's wheat self-sufficient this year, yet South Africa was last wheat self-sufficient in 1989. And we're going to probably be maize food self-sufficient this year. We've been out producing in terms of tobacco and other crops. That is a good thing because the Zimbabwean has learned how to use their land. They've learned how to produce. But what our government has got to understand is that that land doesn't have any meaning if that land is going to be infertile because of synthetic fertilizers that come from the West. We have to use fertilizers that make our land fertile, and those are organic fertilizers. We also will not be able to take our country forward if we're going to use seeds that do not belong to us or seeds that are actually reducing in virility. So we need to stop using genetically modified foods where Zimbabwe doesn't have them, but more critically, we also must not use hybrids. And the problem right now in Zimbabwe is that hybrids are taking over. But the problem with hybrids is they seem improved, they give you a yield, but they reduce in their virility over time until they stop reproducing. And that is a problem for food self-sufficiency. Because we will see that in Europe, there's a company called Lima Grain. In Zimbabwe, it is invested in a company called Seedco as Valmorin.
Did you know this fun fact? It's not a fun fact, it's a weird fact about Zimbabwe. In the past, during the British colonization, they had these companies that would rule Africa on behalf of the British. Of course, the British were still the heads of these companies. In East Africa, we had the Imperial British East African Company. In South Africa, we had the Imperial South African British Company. In West Africa, we had the Imperial British West African Company. In South Africa, the Imperial British South African Company, there was a man called Cecil Rhodes who was in charge of a sector of South Africa because we regard Zambia and Zimbabwe as part of South Africa. Not South Africa as a country, but as a region. Let me say Southern Africa, right? Yeah. Now, this man's name was Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was the man in charge of this sector that we today know as Zambia and Zimbabwe. Back then, during the reign of this British colonizer, it was called Northern Rhodesia, and the southern side was called Southern Rhodesia. Now, the northern side, or rather the Northern Rhodesia, is what we call today Zambia. The Southern Rhodesia is what we call today Zimbabwe. You get it? So it was named after Cecil Rhodes, Rhodesian Rhodes. You get the connection. Yeah. It was up until Africans got their independence that Africans decided to dissolve the name Rhodesia from their countries, right? Even in Africa, in Kenya, the Lake Victoria was not called Lake Victoria. It was always called Namlolwe. In African language, Namlolwe. Lake Victoria was named after the Victoria Queen. It had its name in Kenyan side, it had its name in the Tanzanian side, it had its name on the Ugandan side, because this lake is shared among 3 countries. But the European decided to call it Lake Victoria. That one stuck. But for Northern Rhodesia and Southern Rhodesia, it didn't. Right? I think the cake was too big. Now, what follows is that Northern Rhodesia and Southern Rhodesia, when they got the independence, they decided to take away these names and retain their African names. Zambia and Zimbabwe for what we see today. Zimbabwe, after You know, the person with whom we were told so much that he's a dictator, you know, he raised a lot of controversy in the minds of very many Africans. I myself, I regard what Mugabe did as a nice thing to return back land from the white settlers into the hands of the black farmers. Right? Mugabe didn't steal a land from the white people, as the Western media puts it. He took back what belonged to the Africans and gave it back to them. To the Western media, they think he did a wrong thing until it reached a point when United States of America placed heavy sanctions on the country of Zimbabwe. It was this. We used to joke as a kid that if you want to go and buy bread in Zimbabwe, you need to carry a lot of money in a wheelbarrow. Yeah, that is how we used to joke. Nowadays, I come to think of it, I see it as not a joke. It's not a joke at all. It's an oppression that was placed on that country that made it that way. Zimbabwe took away land and they took away the economy that was being backed by the US dollar. But better to die standing than to live begging. That is what Mugabe stood by. There is a problem, however. After taking this land, there was a problem. And this problem is being discussed by a Zimbabwean who lives in South Africa. He was introduced in an interview where he gave a lot of discussions concerning the problem of land and Africans and white people in South Africa. Let's listen to him, and then I shall give you my thoughts by the end of the video. Of course, where we shall also have a deep, critical analysis. Let's dive in.
To say. I want to give an example of what happened in Zimbabwe, Rutendo, where we had President Mugabe and then now a new President Mnangagwa. And during the era, the time of Mugabe, they took away land. And they thought that was a good thing. Good or bad, I don't know, highly debatable. But where is the country now? What was the advantage of such? Is it still working for the country?
So, as you heard me saying, I gave the history of how capitalism was created by primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation in Africa became colonialism that took away land from the people. And when people do not have land, you are reliant on those that have land to provide food for the people.
Absolutely.
And so Zimbabwe was never going to develop as long as the land was in the hands of the same colonizer and the same settler that was occupying their land and colonizing them and wanting to create dependency in them. Zimbabwe was never going to prosper that way. So Zimbabwe had to deconstruct what the Israelites have done in the Bible, which is to take back your land so that you can be dependent on yourself. And you need to take 40 years within the desert to learn how it is to be self-sufficient people and people who believe in yourselves. And that's exactly what has been happening in Zimbabwe. And now we're starting to see Zimbabwe is wheat self-sufficient this year. And it's wheat self-sufficient this year, yet South Africa was last wheat self-sufficient in 1989. And we're going to probably be maize food self-sufficient this year. We've been out producing in terms of tobacco and other crops. That is a good thing because the Zimbabwean has learned how to use their land. They've learned how to produce. But what our government has got to understand is that that land doesn't have any meaning if that land is going to be infertile because of synthetic fertilizers that come from the West. We have to use fertilizers that make our land fertile, and those are organic fertilizers. We also will not be able to take our country forward if we're going to use seeds that do not belong to us or seeds that are actually reducing in virility. So we need to stop using genetically modified foods where Zimbabwe doesn't have them, but more critically, we also must not use hybrids. And the problem right now in Zimbabwe is that hybrids are taking over. But the problem with hybrids is they seem improved, they give you a yield, but they reduce in their virility over time until they stop reproducing. And that is a problem for food self-sufficiency. Because we will see that in Europe, there's a company called Immigrant. In Zimbabwe, it is invested in a company called Seedco as Valmorin. Valmorin destroyed the tomato seeds of Europe by hybridizing them, to a point where when people buy tomatoes, they cannot take that same tomato and squeeze the seeds out to make it grow. The hybrids are also low in nutrition because what gives the hybrid a high productivity is hybrid vigor. That hybrid vigor reduces the nutrition within the food. Okay. And so that means that the food we're eating is less nutritious, and then it can't reproduce, so you're always going to have to buy seeds. So what Valmorin has done, or Immigrant has done in Europe, is that they've become such a monopoly on seeds of tomatoes that they sell seeds in Europe for anything from 60,000 euros a kg to 400,000 euros a kg. If you put that in African terms, it means that we'll have to pay more than a kg of gold for seeds to produce tomatoes. And if we allow the rest of our food to be destroyed in Africa, we will then have the same situation that Lima grain has created in Europe. So knowledge about this by our governments and them understanding that our traditional seeds is what we need so that our foods can be drought resistant. We also need to look at nature. This notion that scientists always know how to improve is not true, because nature shows us that nature in the bushes, in the Amazon, food is feeding trillions of animals without being hybridized, without being plowed, without being watered, without being farmed by human beings. But the moment human beings take seeds, they meddle with them. These seeds don't reproduce, they don't grow in droughts, they don't adapt to climate, they don't adapt to diseases. Then finally, our government has got to understand the need to use organic fertilizers. In Zimbabwe, we've got various types of organic fertilizers that have been there. The Americans went to war for what were called the Guano Islands. Guano Islands were islands that had birds that used to defecate on those islands, and that bird poop is what was the best fertilizer in the 1900s before the Rockefellers discovered oil. And it is out of oil and petrochemicals that the new fertilizers came, so they destroyed the use of guano, which America went to war to take guano islands in order to have organic fertilizer that if you put in the soil, it improves the quality of the soil, it makes the living organisms in the soil live longer, and the living organisms in that soil also eat the pests and bacteria that become your pests on your crop. So that kind of traditional type of food growing that was organic, that was made by nature and mimicked nature is what we need to do. And this scientific focus on trying to improve what it is that the Creator did will never work, because we don't know what it is that the Creator did. And I know I said finally, but this another thing is our governments must understand that the hybridization and the genetic modification of seeds can cause what is called the weaponization of seeds into something even more dangerous than nuclear weapons. So
the weaponization, that's a very strong word.
Oh yes, yeah. Because some of these seeds can be genetically engineered to actually produce toxins that can target certain RNAs that belong to certain ethnicities or certain races. It can also, right now there is a GMO that was created in 2002 already that actually had the gene of women who had a sperm-killing mechanism within them. It's actually a disease where they kill sperm when it gets into them. So scientists went and took that gene that kills the sperm and put it into a maize crop so that that maize crop would automatically make women have an ability to kill sperm when it gets into them to make them infertile. And this seed exists. It was patented in the United States. And these are the kind of weapons that we already have that can target certain ethnicities, can give them cancer, can give them, and so forth and so on.
And that's why we see the rise of all sorts of cancers right now worldwide.
Supposed to be free, there are 54 countries. We come to the United Nations, it's ceremonial. Every year, September, we are there. We pay lots of money to go there. And to the General Assembly, we make speeches, we go back home, year in, year out. But the bosses in the Security Council say, you shall never have the powers that we have as permanent members. And we have asked and asked and asked. And asked and asked. Reform the Security Council. I want to tell you, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, you are a good man. You are a good man. But of course, we can't make you a fighter. That's not what your mission was. We will fight a fight for our own identity, for our own integrity and personality as Africans. We are Africans.
Now, after carefully listening to this video, we can clearly come to a conclusion that the issue of land in Zimbabwe is an issue that has affected a lot of black people. And we can see that these very black people who have been affected by the issue of land are moving all the way to South Africa to seek accommodation, to seek food. Mostly, I think it's about food security. You know, one thing that the interviewee explained in the video is that when there is no land, the people who don't have land depend on the ones who have land. That's true. It's a logical statement, right? But how did this start? How did the Zimbabweans who had a lot of land came to lack land in Zimbabwe? Remember when I told you by the beginning of the video that Zimbabwe was called Southern Rhodesia, right? And so for this reason, Cecil Rhodes had given a lot of land to the white people. It was up until the independence of Zimbabwe that we saw the president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, took land away from the white settlers and gave it to the black people of South Africa. Zimbabwe, sorry. This was because he didn't grab land from the whites. He gave back blacks the land that was theirs, right? Now, what follows is that these white settlers were doing agriculture on this very plantation that Mugabe took away from them. And you can see that even though the Zimbabweans might be having the land back, the land has been distorted. The land has been removed of all the necessary ingredients or nutrients, if you like calling it so, that will make vegetations grow well, you know. The use of fertilizer, such as the ones which the Europeans were using in those plantations, the use of crossbreeding mechanisms, the use of techniques to improve crops, these methods had made the land in Zimbabwe not arable at all. It made the soils infertile. And you know, for the black settlers, for the black farmers in South Africa, not settlers, the settlers were the whites. They came to settle all the way from whichever place they came from. Now, the white plantations, white plantations, sorry for the confusion. The white plantations, which were owned by the white settlers, had a heavy use of chemicals, and these left the African land barren. Even though they left the land barren. And we still might have a problem of land despite Robert Mugabe giving it back to the Africans. It's only good maybe to build, but you can't build hungry. You need agriculture, and most part of the land we have in the world today has not been used for building. It has been used for agriculture. At least I can say that in my own account in Africa, in Kenya, we have very huge plantations of cash crops. It can be sisal, it can be pineapples, it can be bananas, it can be cassava, very huge plantations if you compare to the size of land that has been used for building, right? So what the gentleman is saying is true, because Bill Gates has been promoting the agenda of bringing GMO to Africa. But we know the problem of GMO to Africa. The GMO that are brought to Africa, they are full of chemicals. Even if you leave the prospect of them affecting the soil, there is another prospect by which they can even cause diseases to us. Those people don't care about African lives. They care about their pockets. As long as their pockets are full, they're okay. It's upon the African leaders. It's upon the African presidents, leaders, just leaders in totality, to come up front and protect Africans from these Western advances. Because with no time, we might not have even enough land, not even enough, no land. We might have no land for agriculture, because we are taking in so much of this Western technology and placing it on our farms, and it affects us as black people. That is my perspective, and I think that we should remain with the way nature was. Nature didn't use a lot of chemicals we use today. Lands are very much barren. You can't even do a simple tomato farming, you know. You need fertilizer which is made from chemicals which drains the soil. In the past, Africans used animal refuses, animal remains to grow their plants, but today that's not the same. Yeah, thanks to Bill Gates and his likes, we don't have land as it used to be in the past. Yeah, I hope you get learned by this content and you get educated that indeed these are the challenges we are facing in Africa. And so you as a Black American, you as an African diaspora, when you come to Africa, you become smart. Yeah. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you get enlightened, and if you do, subscribe, support me on Patreon, give us super thanks. I'll so much appreciate, and I totally appreciate for those who have offered have extended their generosity and kindness. Yeah, thanks you guys. See you in the next.